I was 72 when my daughter told me I should just move in with someone, as if love or even a little companionship had an expiration date. My son laughed and said, "Mom, nobody your age needs a mortgage." They meant well, I think, but the way they said it, like my life was over, like I should just fade into someone else's spare room, that stayed with me. So one morning I got dressed, put on my late husband's watch, and drove down to the bank. The young teller looked at me like I was lost, but I knew exactly what I wanted. They said I was too old to remarry, too old to start over, too old to dream. So I decided to do the one thing nobody expected. I bought myself a house. And that house changed everything. After the funeral, the house felt too quiet. I remember coming home that evening, still wearing the black dress my daughter had helped me pick out. The air inside seemed heavier, thicker somehow. The kind of silence that doesn't just sit in the room, it sits on your chest. His shoes were still by the door, his coat still hanging on the hook. I couldn't bring myself to move a thing. For 50 years, this was the place where we laughed, fought, danced in the kitchen when no one was watching. And now it was just me and the sound of the refrigerator humming like it was trying to fill the emptiness. The nights were the hardest. I'd lie in bed and still reach for the other side, half asleep, expecting to feel his hand there. Sometimes I'd wake up thinking I heard his voice, calling from the hallway, asking if I'd made coffee. I'd sit up, heart racing, before realizing it was just the wind outside brushing against the old window panes. You never realize how much sound another person makes until they're gone, their footsteps, their breathing, the small noises that used to annoy you now become the ones you miss most. I tried to keep busy at first. I'd water the plants, fold laundry that didn't need folding, wipe down clean counters just to have something to do. I'd talk to him sometimes out loud like he was still sitting in his recliner by the window. "You'd laugh at me right now," I'd say, dusting the bookshelf he always meant to fix. "Still trying to keep this place together without you." It sounds strange, I know, but it helped. Talking to the air felt less lonely than talking to no one at all. My children came by often those first few weeks. My daughter, Emily, brought groceries and fussed over my eating. My son, Mark, checked the gutters and made sure the locks worked. They meant well, I know they did, but every visit came with that same tone. The kind people use when they're trying not to show their pity. The way they said things like, "You shouldn't be alone so much, Mom," or "You'd be happier if you sold this old place and moved closer to us." It always ended with some version of "It's for your own good." I smiled, nodded, said I'd think about it. But inside, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years, the need to prove I wasn't done living yet. One evening, a few weeks after the funeral, Emily cooked dinner in my kitchen. The smell of garlic and butter almost masked the ache in the room. She was telling me about a retirement community near her house. They have yoga, book clubs, even a shuttle to the grocery store, she said, as if that would sell me on the idea of packing up a lifetime of memories. Mark laughed and said, "You could even find a nice widower, Mom, someone to keep you company." They chuckled together. I didn't. I just sat there listening, smiling politely, while something in me, something small and stubborn, stirred awake. That night after they left, I stood at the window and watched their cars drive away. The tail lights disappeared down the street and the house fell silent again. I looked around at the dining table we bought secondhand when we couldn't afford new furniture, at the chipped teacup on the counter, at the photo of my husband smiling at me from our trip to the coast. And I thought, maybe they're right. Maybe this house is too big for me now. Maybe I am getting old. But then another thought pushed through, quieter but sharper. Who says being old means being finished? The next morning, I got up early and sat on the porch with my coffee, the same way we used to every Sunday. The air was cool, and the neighborhood was just waking up, dogs barking, sprinklers hissing, a mail truck humming down the street. It reminded me that life keeps moving with or without your permission. I watched the sun peek through the trees and thought, I'm still here. It wasn't much of a revelation, but it was a start. Over the next few days, I started noticing how different the house looked in the morning light. It wasn't just a place full of memories. It was a place that had held me through every season of my life. This was the home where I raised two children, taught them to walk, to write their names, to dream big. The house that saw birthday candles, stormy nights, quiet forgiveness after arguments. Maybe that's why it hurt so much to hear my children talk about it like it was just a pile of wood and bricks. To them, it was old. To me, it was sacred. but I also knew they were worried. Maybe they saw something in me I didn't want to face, the loneliness, the slowing pace, the way my hands trembled sometimes when I carried the laundry basket. They saw my age, I saw my life, and maybe both of us were right in our own way. One afternoon, I found myself sitting in his old chair, flipping through an old album. The pages smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. There was a picture of us, younger and fearless, standing in front of the same house with paint on our faces and hope in our eyes. We were just kids then, building a future out of nothing but love and stubbornness. I laughed softly, tracing his face with my finger. "We really thought we'd have forever," I whispered. Then, without meaning to, I said, "But maybe forever just looks different now." That evening, Emily called again. She wanted me to come stay with her just for a few weeks. She said it would help me get used to company again. I almost agreed, almost, but something in my chest, maybe pride, maybe purpose, made me say, "Sweetheart, I appreciate it, but I think I'm fine here for now." There was silence on the other end. Then she sighed and said, "You always were stubborn, Mom." I smiled. "You say that like it's a bad thing." After the call, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the teapot between my hands. The room felt different that night, not emptier, just quieter, calmer. I realized I wasn't afraid of being alone. I was afraid of being told what I couldn't do anymore, afraid of living on other people's terms. That thought, that little spark from before, began to grow into something stronger. The next morning, I started cleaning. Not the kind of cleaning you do for guests, but the kind you do when you're ready to start fresh. I opened windows, let the air in, played some old jazz records I hadn't touched since my husband passed. I laughed to myself as I danced around the living room, broom in hand. If the neighbors saw me, they probably thought I'd lost it. But for the first time in a long while, I felt alive. When Mark stopped by later that week, he noticed the change. "You've been busy," he said, looking around at the open windows and sunlight streaming in. "What's going on, Mom?" I just smiled and said, "Spring cleaning." He looked puzzled but didn't push. I didn't tell him that while I was dusting the bookshelves, I'd found an old folder of my husband's property listings from years ago, back when we used to dream of retiring near the coast. That folder sparked an idea I hadn't allowed myself to think before. Maybe it wasn't too late to dream again. That night, I sat at my desk, pen in hand, and started writing a list, things I'd always wanted to do but never did because life got in the way. At the top, I wrote, "Find a place that's mine." I didn't know what that meant yet, a new house, a new chapter, maybe both. But I knew one thing, I wasn't going to let the world decide when my story ended. As I put the list away and turned off the lamp, I whispered into the dark, "You'd understand, wouldn't you?" I could almost hear his laugh in the quiet. The house creaked softly, like it was listening. And for the first time since he died, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like space for something new, something waiting to begin. And I had no idea that what started as defiance would soon turn into freedom. It started slow, the way pity often does. At first, I thought my children were just being kind, trying to look out for me. After all, I was still finding my footing, learning how to live in a house that suddenly felt too big and too quiet. But over time, their visits started to change. The tone of their voices softened in a way that didn't sound comforting anymore. It sounded cautious, like they were talking to someone fragile, someone who might break if spoken to too firmly. One Sunday afternoon, my daughter Emily came over with her laptop. She sat at my kitchen table, that same table I've had since she was a teenager, and she said, "Mom, I think you should try online dating." I almost laughed, thinking she was joking, but she was. "You know," she said, scrolling through some website I couldn't even read without my glasses, just for companionship. "There are sites for seniors now, you don't have to be alone." She said it so cheerfully, like she was suggesting a new recipe or a TV show to binge. I smiled and said, "Emily, I've got plenty of companionship. The radio keeps me company just fine." She laughed a little, but her eyes stayed worried, the kind of look you give a child who doesn't understand something obvious. Then there was Mark. My son's always been the practical one, the problem solver. A few days later, he called me after work and said, "Mom, we should sit down soon and go over your finances. You don't need to be worrying about all that stuff anymore." That word "need" stuck to me like a burr. I told him I'd been paying bills longer than he'd been alive, but he just chuckled and said, "I know, Mom, I just want to make sure you're not getting overwhelmed." Overwhelmed. I remember hanging up the phone and staring at my reflection in the kitchen window, thinking, when did they start thinking of me like this? They didn't mean harm, I know that. They thought they were helping. But that's how it starts, isn't it? First, it's help with the groceries, then the bills, then the decisions. Little by little, people stop seeing you as capable. They start seeing you as old, not wise, not seasoned, just old. The next family gathering didn't make it any easier. It was Emily's idea, a small dinner, just the four of us, me, her, Mark, and his wife, Lydia. I brought dessert, my late husband's favorite lemon cake. Emily had wine poured before I even took off my coat. We sat around the table, laughter filling the room like old times. For a while, I forgot the heaviness I'd been feeling. Then, somewhere between dessert and coffee, Lydia leaned forward with that half smile she wears when she's about to say something funny. She said, "So, Marjorie, have you met anyone new yet, or are you waiting for one of those retirement romances?" Everyone laughed, even Emily. The kind of laughter that fills the room but empties the air around you. I smiled because that's what women my age do in those moments. We smile so no one feels uncomfortable, but my heart felt small in my chest like it was shrinking. I said lightly, "I think one marriage was enough adventure for me." They laughed again, and the conversation moved on. But I couldn't stop hearing it, that undercurrent in their laughter that said, "She's alone now. She's harmless. She's done." Later that night, when I got home, I didn't even take my coat off right away. I walked straight into the living room and sat down on the sofa. The room was dark except for the small lamp by my husband's chair. His picture sat on the side table, the one from our 40th anniversary. He was smiling, his hand on my shoulder. I picked it up and whispered, "Can you believe that's how they see me now?" I set the photo down and looked around the room, really looked. Every corner told our story, the books we'd read together, the blanket he used to drape over my legs when we watched movies, the dent in the sofa where he always sat. But instead of comfort, all I felt was distance. Like the house itself was moving further away from me. I went to the kitchen, made myself some tea, and sat by the window. The street was quiet, the kind of calm that used to make me feel safe but now felt lonely. A thought came to me then, quiet but sharp. Maybe they weren't wrong about me being alone. Maybe they were just wrong about what I needed. I didn't want companionship. I didn't want someone to manage my money or make sure I wasn't overwhelmed. I wanted something bigger, something that felt like mine, not my husband's, not my children's, not anyone else's, just mine. The next day, Emily stopped by again, all sunshine and energy, and said, "Mom, I signed you up for a dating site. Don't worry, I used a nice photo." I could have gotten angry, but I didn't. I just looked at her, my grown daughter, who once cried when I let her ride her bike alone, and said, "Sweetheart, thank you, but I don't need a man to make me feel alive." She blinked like she wasn't sure what to say and finally muttered, "It's not about that, Mom. It's just people your age shouldn't be alone." That night I couldn't sleep. Her words replayed over and over, people your age. I lay there staring at the ceiling, wondering what exactly that meant. Was there a rule book somewhere that said after 70 you stop trying, stop dreaming, stop living your own life? I got up and wandered through the house. My footsteps echoed softly. When I reached the living room, I sat down again in front of that old photo, the one of me and him, and said, "You'd tell me to go for it, wouldn't you?" I could almost hear his voice in my head. "Marjorie, when have you ever let anyone tell you what you can't do?" I smiled. It was the first real smile I'd had in days. The next morning, when Emily called, I didn't mention the dating site. I just told her I was thinking of redecorating. "That's nice, Mom," she said distractedly. Keep busy, but I wasn't talking about keeping busy. I was talking about creating space for myself, for something new, even if I didn't know what that was yet. Later that week, I went through old boxes in the attic. There were photo albums, old clothes, newspaper clippings, and then I found something that stopped me. It was a letter my husband had written me on our 25th anniversary. His handwriting was shaky even then, but I could still make out the words. "If you ever find yourself alone, promise me you won't stop living. Build something new, even if it's just a dream." I read that line 3 times. Then I folded the letter, put it in my pocket, and went downstairs. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel sad. I felt steady, clear. When Mark came over the following weekend to check on things, he noticed the open boxes and said, "You finally cleaning out the attic?" I told him yes. He smiled, relieved, thinking it meant I was finally letting go. But what I was really doing was preparing, making space for something that hadn't even taken shape yet. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea, listening to the ticking clock. The air felt different. I looked at the empty chair across from me and said softly, They think I'm done, but I'm not, not yet. Outside, the wind rattled the window, but instead of feeling lonely, I felt strong. There's something powerful about being underestimated. It gives you freedom. People stop watching what you do when they think you're too old to surprise them. And that was when the idea started to bloom, small, quiet, and unstoppable. I didn't know what it would become yet, but I could feel it growing inside me like the first hint of spring after a long winter. I looked around the room at all the things that once defined my life and whispered, maybe it's time for something that's just mine. I didn't know it then, but that was the night everything began to change. The morning I said, "It's time," the words hardly sounded like a decision. They sounded like the turning of a page. I woke early before the sun and sat on the edge of the bed where his side still felt warm in my memory. For a long moment, I listened to the house breathe, the pipes settling, the old clock ticking in the hallway, the distant hum of a neighbor's radio. I folded my hands in my lap and thought of the letter I'd found, the one with his steady, foolish handwriting telling me to keep living. The thought of him saying those words felt like permission. I made coffee and wrapped my hands around the mug as if it were an anchor. I didn't tell anyone that morning. I didn't call Emily or Mark. There was a small, private happiness in the idea that this would be mine, no audience, no advice, no pity. I dressed in the sweater he used to like and pulled on an old pair of comfortable shoes. The house felt different with me moving through it with intention, like the rooms were waking up with me. The first open house I wandered into was a little bungalow on the edge of town. The realtor there greeted me with the polite smile people give someone they think is just looking. "Just browsing?" she asked, key jangling at her hip. "Yes," I said, "just looking." She assumed, of course, that I was tag along for a younger relative. She offered me a pamphlet in a tone that said, "Call your son, he'll handle it." I took the pamphlet and walked in, letting my hands trail along the banister, looking at the sunlight through the windows, the cup ring on the kitchen table, the way an old house smells like itself. There was a kind of intimacy in every scuffed floorboard and curtain hem. I could imagine mornings here, tea steaming on the windowsill, a radio playing some old jazz while I planted something in the yard. But every time I asked a question, the realtor's answers were small, as if she didn't think I meant business. After a few houses like that, too small, too far, too new, I began to recognize a pattern. People assumed an elderly woman wandering through listings was harmless, curious at best. I began to time my visits for mid-weekday mornings when the agents were less busy and perhaps more likely to listen. Sometimes I'd pretend to be on the phone, just long enough to watch how quickly they'd offer to get someone to help me. They'd say, "If you like it, I can call your children and get the paperwork started." It made me smile the first few times, then tighten my jaw the later times. I didn't like the way the world tried to put me into neat, small boxes. On a humid Thursday in June, I walked into a showing and the air in the house seemed to breathe with me. A young agent named Claire met me at the door with real eyes, no condescension, just a professional curiosity. She was the first person who treated me the way I'd been used to being treated when I was younger, like a person with preferences, not a problem to be solved. "You're early," she said, with a friendly tilt to her head. "Would you like a tour?" "Yes, please," I said. We moved from room to room together. The house was modest, not new, but it had a bright honesty about it, a wraparound porch that caught the light in the late afternoon, a kitchen window that looked out over a small yard, and floors that creaked in the kind of friendly way only old homes do. There was sunlight pooling on the counter, and for the first time in a long while, the sunlight felt like an invitation rather than something that highlighted the emptiness of my own walls. "I can see you here," Claire said once when I paused in the kitchen and ran a hand across the windowsill as if to feel the sun. "You like natural light." "I do," I said. "It makes everything look possible." She laughed, and then she told me the practical bits: taxes, neighborhood, the history of the property. Her voice was clear. When she handed me the brochure, she looked me in the eye and said, "If you want, I can show you the paperwork, or I can give you a few days, whatever you need." Her respect felt like a small, surprising kindness. I'd grown used to explanations and gentle redirects. Claire offered options, not judgments. It felt luxurious. I came back twice that week, once in the late afternoon with nothing but a notebook tucked under my arm, and once on a bright Saturday when a breeze wandered in through the porch. Each time I wandered the rooms, imagining small, sensible changes. A curtain here, a pot of herbs there. I pictured evenings on the porch with a small lamp, the book in my lap, neighbors coming by now and again for a cup of coffee. I imagined a life where I would make new routines, different from those I'd shared with him, but quiet and nourishing in their own way. The thought that kept visiting me was not dramatic. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was softer, a desire to hold a space that belonged to me in a way that wasn't defined by what I had been, but by what I could still be. The idea of packing up the life we'd built, of folding his shirts and stacking them in moving boxes, of choosing which memories to take and which to leave, that frightened me. But the idea of walking a new threshold each morning and knowing it was mine, that felt like a gift. When I told Emily that I'd been looking at houses, she made a noise halfway between concern and amusement. "Mom," she said, "are you serious? You're not thinking of buying anything, are you? It's a big step." She paused, and I could see the worry lining her voice. "Do you think you can handle it all?" "I think I can," I said, steady. I told her about Claire and the porch and the light. She sounded unsure. "Mom, what about the mortgage, the maintenance? It's a lot for one person." "It is," I said, "but I'm not buying it for other people. I'm buying it for me." "You don't have to do this alone, you know," she said. "We can help." "You already help, sweetheart," I said, because I didn't want to argue with her love. "But this is something I want to do." Mark tried to be practical, as he always had. "We've looked at your finances," he said on another call. "We don't want you overextending yourself. Are you sure this is smart?" "I'm sure," I said. I didn't tell him I'd been saving quietly for years. The small, stubborn account I'd opened when I was 30 and we could barely afford dinner out. I'd added to it in pennies and dollars, nothing dramatic, but over decades it had grown into a little nest that felt like the future he'd written to me about in that shaky anniversary note. The day I decided to put an offer in, I woke with the peculiar buoyancy of someone finally acting on a long simmering thought. My hands didn't tremble the way they sometimes did these days. They felt steady, capable. Claire met me at the office that morning with a fresh pot of coffee and a smile that shared in the gravity of what I was about to do. "We'll need your ID, proof of funds, and your signature," she said gently, as if she knew how small the act of signing could feel when it contained a whole new life. It was quieter than I expected. There was no trumpet, no grand ceremony, just the scratch of a pen and the soft rustle of paper. Claire slid the contract across the table and watched me with an honest, almost reverent patience as I read the lines. There were numbers and legal phrases and the sort of language that sounds like someone else's life until you sign and it becomes yours. When I signed, the pen felt warm in my hand, and a small smile lifted my lips like a secret. I felt oddly like a young girl again, the kind who would stand on a stoop with skinned knees and feel that electric, brimming certainty that something good was on the other side of the front door. I told no one until the papers were done. I wanted the moment to be clean, without commentary. I walked back into my house that afternoon carrying nothing but a small cardboard box with a few keepsakes in it: the letter, a favorite teacup, a sprig of dried lavender. The rooms looked the same, but I felt different. There was a quiet thrill in the ordinary, folding a towel and feeling content that the towel was mine to fold, boiling water for tea and savoring the steam as my own. That night I sat on the porch steps where the light fell soft and golden, and I realized how much of life is not grand gestures but small, persistent acts of courage. You don't have to storm a fortress to be brave. Sometimes being brave is learning the shape of your own kitchen and deciding you like it. I knew the family would react one way or another. I knew Emily would worry and Mark would measure the math of it. But for the first time in a long while, I felt clear about what I wanted and capable of making a choice for myself. The house I bought was not an act of spite. It was a quiet, stubborn affirmation that my life still had room to unfold. As I closed my eyes on the porch that night, the wind moved through the trees and the house hummed its evening song. For the first time in months, the silence felt full, not heavy, full of the possibility of mornings yet to come. They found out sooner than I'd planned. I suppose I should have expected it. News like that rarely sits quiet for long. Emily called first, the way she always does when she can't quite believe what I'm up to. "Mom," she said, breathless, "are you serious? A house? You bought a house?" Her voice was half astonishment, half reproach. I could hear the unasked questions behind it. Did you think this through? Did you check the mortgage rates? Who are you talking to about maintenance? Yes, I said, and I kept my voice as steady as I could. I am. There was a pause, and then the charm of her practical worry came through like a reflex. Marjorie, you're 72. You're supposed to be downsizing, not signing mortgages. You know how much work a house is. She tried to keep it light, but the concern was there, threaded through every sentence. And you're supposed to be what, Emily? I asked, though I didn't mean to be sharp. I only wanted her to understand the way those words landed. What I'm supposed to be doesn't matter. I just wanted a place that didn't feel like someone else's memory. She sighed, and there was the sound of a daughter juggling love and worry. We can help, Mom. We can look into it with you. Maybe there's a program, or I didn't buy it for programs, I said. I bought it because I felt something there. I described the porch, the way the kitchen caught the light, the friendly creak in the floor. I could hear her softening a little image by image. It felt like a house that wanted to be lived in. When Mark came over that evening, he had the sort of practicality that pretends not to be emotional but always is. He folded his hands on the kitchen table and looked at me like he was trying to solve a complicated math problem. You put an offer in, he asked. How did you do? I met Claire, I said. She was kind. She treated me like a person, not a problem. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. Mom, I'm not against you being happy, but you need to be careful. There are inspections, taxes, upkeep. You'll need someone to handle the yard, the plumbing, the winter storms. It's a lot. It's a lot for one person, I agreed. But I'm not asking you to do it for me. I'm asking you to trust me. Trust is a funny thing in families. It can mean the willingness to let someone carry on when you think they cannot, and it can mean the courage to step back and watch them try. For my children, stepping back looked riskier than helping. For me, stepping forward felt like the difference between living and waiting. They didn't come right away to see the house. That was their choice. I didn't resent them for it. People need their own pace to accept a change that challenges how they imagine you. But the phone calls multiplied, advice given freely, worry wrapped in instructions. I listened to everyone and nodded. Some of it I filed away as useful. Much of it I set aside like a coat I might wear later if the weather turned rough. Then one afternoon, Emily appeared at my door with a casserole and a look that said she'd rehearsed what to say only to find her script clumsy against the living room walls. She stepped in, set the dish on my counter, and hugged me quick and tight. I wanted to see you, she said. Her smile was brave. We sat at the table, and she watched me over her cup of tea like she was trying to find the exact moment I changed. Show me, she said finally. Show me the house. So I did. I told her the story of Claire, the way the porch light had made the whole kitchen glow, the way the yard sloped toward the little maples like it had been planted for afternoons of reading. I told her about signing the papers and the way the pen felt warm and steady under my hand. I told her, too, that I'd brought just a few things with me that first day, the watch of his that I still wore sometimes, the teacup with a chip on the rim he always joked about, and the chair that had molded itself to us after decades of use. She listened, and as I talked, the worry on her face softened into something else, a dawning pride, maybe, or the embarrassment of a child who suddenly sees their parent in a new role. I'm sorry, she said, the words small and honest. I worried I was being selfish, telling you not to do it. I was thinking about the risks, but not about how you'd feel. You worried like a mother, I said. I know, I worried like your mother, too. When Mark finally drove up to the new place, he looked quieter than usual. He stood on the porch and ran his hand along the railing before knocking. I opened the door and he stepped inside like he was entering a story he had only heard about. He walked through the room slowly, touching the trim, lingering by the window the way a person touches a place to check if it's true. It looks like you, he said at last. It's you. Good, I said. It's just me. The words hung in the air like something both simple and important. He sat down and asked me about the mortgage and the insurance and who would help if the heater broke in January. He asked practical questions because that's how he shows love. I answered what I could. I told him I had planned quietly for years. I had a savings account that had been my secret little garden. I had hired a local handyman who owed me a favor and was kind. I had neighbors who already brought over fresh baked bread after I mowed a lawn last week. The world is full of helpers if you allow them the chance. Still, Mark said slowly, I didn't want you to feel like you had to prove something to us. I'm not proving anything, I said. I'm proving something to myself. There was a weight to that, not a weight of anger, but the solid heft of a woman who'd finally acted on a quiet want. It was not spiteful. It wasn't meant to punish them for their worry. It was a slow claim, like planting a stake and saying, "This is mine and I will make it home." The day I moved, I packed what mattered most. I surprised myself by how little I needed: a few quilts, my tea kettle, his watch that fit around my wrist like a compass, the chipped teacup, and my favorite chair that had become a kind of throne in the corner of our living room. I could have filled a truckload if I wanted to, but I wanted space in the new rooms for new memories to arrive. I wanted to leave room for whatever would come next. Neighbors I'd met at the realtor's open house came with boxes and smiles. Claire dropped by with a small houseplant and a list of recommended handymen. A young couple from down the street brought over a casserole and a broom that matched my porch. It felt like being welcomed into a small, accidental village. On the drive from the old house to the new, Emily rode with me in the passenger seat. She watched the familiar streets slip past, and then, for the first time in months, she reached across and took my hand. "I'm proud of you," she said, like someone finally saying what they meant to say months ago and had been too tangled in concern to voice. Her thumb stroked the back of my hand, an old, steady gesture that used to chase away nightmares when she was small. By the time we pulled up to the little house, late afternoon had painted everything in that sweet golden light that makes colors softer and decisions feel easier. I parked, and we carried the boxes in together. Emily fussed over where to set the chair, and then, when she saw the watch on my wrist, she touched it gently and said, "He'd be smiling." "He would be," I said. That first week in the new house felt like stepping into a book with thick, unmarked pages. Some evenings, the silence felt heavy, the kind of silence that gathers your breath and holds it for a moment. But most nights, the quiet felt like a blanket. I sat in my chair, made tea, and listened to the house settle. The small noises, the refrigerator's hum, the floor's creak, the steady tick of the clock felt like company. I read aloud sometimes, which made the rooms feel fuller. I opened windows and let the air move through like a new friend wandering in to check on me. When my children visited, they still brought advice and concern, but there was also a new tenderness in their faces. They saw me making a life rather than waiting for one. They noticed the light on my porch and the way the garden in the back seemed to respond to my hands. Emily sent a photo of the teacup arranged in the new kitchen and a short message that said, simply, "Looks peaceful." Mark called more often, not to solve problems, but to hear about my day. Their voices had softened into something like respect. I gave them each a spare key the day after I'd finished unpacking. I placed the keys on the kitchen counter and invited them to take them with the same calm I'd used when I'd signed the papers. "You don't have to understand it," I told them, meaning that their understanding wasn't necessary for my contentment. "Just visit when you want." Emily hesitated, fingers hovering, then picked up a key as if it had weight. She tucked it in her pocket like an admission or a promise. Mark slipped his into his wallet and smiled in that private way fathers and sons have. There were no apologies, no grand declarations, just small movements toward a new normal. The silence that night, the one that had once felt like a hollow drum beating in my chest, was different. It belonged to me. It was not filled with the ghosts of someone else's routines, but patterned by my own hours. I made tea at dusk and set the watch beside the teacup. I sat in my chair and listened to the house breathe. Outside, the street lamp flicked on and a neighbor's dog barked once, then settled down. Inside, I felt the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't demand attention. It simply is. I didn't set out to teach my children a lesson. I simply wanted to live with a small dignity that was mine alone. But living that way changes the people around you whether you want it to or not. Watching them adjust, to see the worry melt into a kind of admiration, was not a reward I'd sought, but it was a gentle gift. And as I opened the window that night and let a breeze stir the curtains, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not triumph exactly, but peace. The kind of peace that comes when you stop asking for permission to be yourself and just begin. Mornings at the little house began the same way, as if someone had set the world to a softer pace just for me. I would wake to that thin, forgiving light that slips in early through the curtains, the kind that makes the dust motes look like tiny planets drifting in their own quiet galaxies. I'd sit up slowly, feeling the mattress beneath me, the shape of the blanket where he used to tuck his toes in at the foot. For a moment, the old habit of reaching across for an empty space was there, then gone. Instead of filling the silence with worry, I padded into the kitchen and set the kettle on, enjoying the small click of the burner as it warmed. I learned very quickly that there is a kind of pleasure to making the same small things in a new place. Boiling water for tea became a ritual again. The cup I chose carefully, the way the steam fogged my glasses for a second, the newspaper folded to the margin I liked. On the porch, the world was larger: trees, distant roofs, the occasional blue of a jay cutting across the yard. I would sit with my tea, my feet tucked under me, and let the world come to me at its slow, neighborly speed. I planted flowers like someone patching a quilt. At first, it was marigolds because they were cheerful and stubborn, the kinds of plants that won't fuss if you forget them for a day. Then I added roses, little old-fashioned ones with a scent that on a warm evening could make me think of his collar and the way he used to smile across a table. Gardening was work that asked nothing grand of me. It asked for patience, and in return it gave patience back. I discovered the pleasure of watching something respond to my hands, a bud uncurl, a leaf right itself after a windy afternoon. There was a satisfaction in tending things that didn't have opinions about my choices. I painted the kitchen a soft yellow because it felt like an inside sunlight. It brightened everything in such a simple way: plates, the chipped teacup I kept, the little shelf where I stacked recipe cards I'd written when the children were small. Painting alone is a meditative business. I found myself humming an old hymn while the brush moved, thinking of nothing and everything at once. There were no raised eyebrows about my taste, no one to say it was too bright or too fussy. The color simply was, and it made the mornings feel warm the way a good story warms you from the inside. Neighbors matter more than you think until you live in a place where faces become part of your days. The man next door, Tom, was the kind of person the town would say helps everyone, and he did. He showed up after I'd been there just a week with a box of nails and a smile, and he mended the mailbox that wobbled in the wind. He wouldn't take payment. Instead, he brought me a jar of canned peaches in late August and told me about the football game last weekend. Sometimes we'd stand on our porches and talk about small things: the best way to prune a rose, where to get the best bargain on paint, how the mail sometimes runs late on Thursdays. His wife would wave from the garden, offering slices of pie if she caught me on an especially good morning, and there was a comfort in that ordinary kindness that felt like a blanket pulled up to your chin. I found myself visible in ways I hadn't been for some time. Not the unseeing visibility people give older women, passing glance, polite nod, but the kind that recognizes the particularity of a person. At the farmer's market, the man who sold eggs began to wrap an extra carton of herbs when he saw me coming, remembering the way I liked my omelets. The librarian smiled and set aside a new novel she thought I'd enjoy. These were small, quiet recognitions, but they were like threads being sewn into my life, and I felt myself stitching into the pattern again. My children came to visit sometimes now, less frequently than I would have liked, but with a tenderness I hadn't expected. Emily arrived one Saturday with a pie and a softness in her eyes, the kind that comes when a person finally sees what they had previously been too busy to notice. She lingered on the porch longer than necessary because I think she wanted to breathe in the air of my new life and know it was real. "Your kitchen looks lovely," she said, stepping inside and setting the pie on the counter. She ran her fingers over the painted cabinets as if reading Braille for beauty. "I can't believe you did all this," she added, a mixture of pride and amazement in her voice. "I did," I said, a little at a time. Mark would come by, wiping his hands on his pants, a practical man who still worried about gutters and insurance. He'd lean against the doorframe like someone trying out a new posture and watch me move around the room. "You look good," he'd say, and then immediately chase the admission with a question. Did the heat pump need a check? How were utilities calculated? Had I met the neighbors? His worry was a kind of love I answered dutifully, and we'd talk through the checklists like two people planning a small, sensible expedition. There was no drama in how they adjusted. It wasn't a single grand turn. It was subtler, a call that lasted longer, a visit stretched into dinner, cookies appearing in the freezer one afternoon when Emily thought I might be lonely. It felt to me like an armor softening. They were learning to see me as a person capable of choosing the life she wanted, rather than as someone to be protected from it. I didn't have to explain the quietness of my revenge. I never set out to make a statement. I simply lived the life I wanted to live, and the rest arranged itself around that. The revenge, if anyone still wanted to call it that, was not about making them pay. It was about showing them what they'd assumed they knew, that a life can still be remade, that joy doesn't have an expiration date, that peace can be carved out in small acts. Watching their surprise when they realized how settled and content I'd become was its own soft vindication. A daughter's hesitation melted into pride, a son's concern loosened into respect. But none of that changed the essential fact: the house and the life in it was mine. I found ways to fill my days that fit into this new rhythm. I volunteered at the school once a week, reading stories in the library to a gaggle of children who smelled like glue and playground dust. Their questions were immediate and unfiltered. "What's your favorite book?" And their delight was uncomplicated and radiant. I joined a small quilting group at the community center where our circle of women would stitch and talk about recipes and losses and the sort of tiny, miraculous things that make a life. I began a small book club with neighbors, two women from down the street and Tom, who surprised us all with the depth of his opinions. We'd meet in my kitchen, sip tea, and talk about characters like they were old acquaintances. I liked these threads of community because they were not founded on obligation but on choice. Evenings at the little house were gentle. I'd light a lamp on the kitchen shelf and read until the words knitted me into sleep, or I'd sit on the porch and watch the sunset wash the world in auburn and gold. The sound of a distant dog, the shout of children playing, the clink of dishes from the neighbor's window at dinner time, these sounds filled the house in the best possible way. They made the silence a companion rather than an absence. Sometimes, when the moon was full and the night was particularly still, I'd take down his watch from the little hook where I kept it. I would lay it on the table beside the teacup and let its small, faithful tick remind me that time moves forward whether we ask it to or not. In those moments, I felt gratitude more than sorrow, gratitude that I'd been given a life with enough breath to choose again. People ask me now and then if I missed him. Of course I did. His absence carved a shape that would never be filled, but I learned that missing someone and moving on are not opposites. They can live together like two things in different rooms that still share the same house. I could love him and also love the life I was quietly building. That understanding settled over me like a familiar shawl. There was a kind of power to living without the need to convince anyone of your rightness. I no longer spent nights composing defenses in my head. I didn't feel the need to justify my choices. The quiet revenge had done what I hoped it would. It gave me back myself. Watching my family understand that slowly in crumbs and then in slices was not a triumph so much as a relief. They didn't have to give me permission to be happy. They just had to see me, and they did. On an ordinary Thursday, as I watered the marigolds at dusk, Emily stepped out onto the porch and watched me for a long moment. She didn't say anything at first. She folded her hands and rested them on the railing, her face softened by that strange, complicated affection that grows between mothers and grown children. "You look peaceful," she said finally, and I could hear how much she meant it. "I am," I replied. "It took me a while to remember how to be." She smiled then, a small, private smile, and for a second we both stood there counting the same blessings. The garden smelled faintly of cut grass and basil. A car drove past slow, and the world went on as it always does. I turned back to the flowers and tucked a stem into place, and in the quiet I felt the shape of the life I'd chosen fitting into me like something made to order. The house was more than walls and paint. It was a promise kept to myself, that life could be tender and full at any age, that revenge need not be fierce to be felt, and that sometimes the most convincing thing you can do is simply live well. They came on a cool Sunday in late October, when the light has that gentle, forgiving quality that makes everything look a little kinder. Emily arrived first, carrying a pie that steamed when she set it on the counter. She smiled the way she always did, small, careful, as if she were testing the world to see whether it would meet her kind intentions in return. Mark came after, wiping his hands on a cloth, looking around as if making sure the furniture was arranged to his sensible eye. They both paused on the porch like people stepping into a theater, polite, a little unsure, and ready for whatever part they had prepared to play. I opened the door and watched them step into the rooms I'd slowly filled with myself. The chair by the window sat where I had placed it, the cushions plumped, the small table beside it holding the teacup with its familiar chip. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and baked apples from Emily's pie, and the yellow paint I'd chosen made the whole house glow from the inside. It felt right, the way a hymn can feel right in the middle of a quiet, ordinary day. They moved through the house like visitors testing the water because the idea that I had bought a home on my own still surprised them. There was softness now in the surprise, though no shock edged with judgment anymore, just that slow, catching realization that the person they had always thought of as someone to worry over had quietly become someone who makes choices. "You really made this place yours," Mark said later, standing in the doorway and looking at the little shelf where I kept his father's watch. It was the sort of sentence that held more than words, it was an acknowledgement. He didn't say the things he had said at first about mortgages and maintenance and prudence. Instead, he let the observation hang there uncomplicated. "I did," I said, smiling as I set the pie on the table. There was a small thrill in hearing the truth of it in my own voice. I'd been careful when I chose this house, not because I wanted to prove anything, but because I wanted a place that felt possible on good mornings and patient on bad ones. It was a practical choice and a tender one both. We ate, and the conversation flowed like a river finding its course. At first, it dipped into small tributaries, favorite recipes, the weather, Tom from next door, and his endless stories about the town. Then, as plates emptied and tea warmed our hands, the talk drifted to places where meaning hides. Memories, regrets, the funny, stubborn things that became the scaffolding of who we are. Emily reached across the table and took my hand while Mark was telling one of his mechanical stories about clunky trucks and stubborn engines. She squeezed my fingers and said, "Mom, I'm glad you did it. I didn't understand at first. I thought you were giving into loneliness, but seeing you here, this is different." It was the sort of apology that doesn't say the word but carries it in its weight. I thought of earlier conversations, the ones where they tried to steer me toward retirement communities and cautious living. I thought of the nights I'd sat alone and considered their cautions seriously, as if wisdom only ever came wrapped in worry. And I thought of the night I signed the papers, the pen steady in my hand, the silence in the room like the hush before a new chapter begins. "You don't have to explain," I told her. "You were worried because you love me, that's what you do." Mark nodded, and for a moment his eyes were a little wet at the corners. He didn't say he was sorry, he didn't have to. The softer shape of his gaze did the work of words. After they left, I stood on the porch for a long time, watching the sky narrow into evening. The house hummed around me, the small sounds of a place that knows its owner. The refrigerator's soft shudder, the clock's sure tick, the way the floorboards sighed once as they cooled. I locked the front door, and the click of the bolt felt like a punctuation mark, a small, decisive sound. Walking through the rooms that were mine felt like moving through a life I had earned, not one I had been assigned. The chair by the window caught the last of the light, the teacup on the saucer held a ring where the tea had dried, a small map of the day. I ran my hand along the spines of the books on the shelf, feeling the familiar ridges of titles that had kept me company. In the kitchen, the table still held crumbs, a record of company and conversation, and I smiled at the evidence. That night, I made a ritual of small things that felt like settling into peace. I brewed tea, warmed the pie's end in the oven, and sat in the chair with the watch in my palm. For years, that watch had been a tether to a life shared, a promise kept in metal and two worn bands. Now it felt like something else, a companion, a memory that didn't require my definition of myself. When I put it on, it fit the wrist the way a familiar song fits an old chorus. There is power in quiet decisions. I had once thought revenge was about making the world see you through the same hurtful lens others used. I had imagined loud triumphs and the satisfaction of being proven right. But living here, with the sunset painting the porch rail in soft gold and the sound of late crickets tuning the evening, I realized my revenge had been different all along. It was not about changing them, it was about changing myself. It was about choosing a life that honored what I had loved and what I still wanted. It was about refusing to let someone else's timetable dictate the terms of my days. I thought of all the small steps that had led me here, the open houses, the patient realtor who treated me like a client and a person, the spare key I had tucked into my pocket when I left the closing office. I remembered the first night in the new house when the silence had felt like a threat, and then, in an ordinary, unremarkable hour, felt like a friend. I remembered Emily's hands worrying soup into the pie crust and Mark's earnest questions that had softened into genuine curiosity. Their respect, earned and quietly admitted, was a gentle salve. They didn't have to say the words I had longed to hear. Their softened gazes, their visits, the way they let me be without fixing me, those were the apologies that mattered more. Later, when the house finally settled and the last of the dishes were rinsed and put away, I climbed the steps to the porch with a blanket over my shoulders. The air had cooled, the sky was thinning to navy blue, and the porch light glowed like a promise kept. I sat down, and the rocking chair made the same old noise it had always made, soft, reliable, a sound that felt like home. I looked out across the street at the silhouette of trees and the warm windows of houses, thinking how many people live inside the stories they tell about themselves and how many of us are given second acts if we let them in. I thought, too, about my husband and the life we had shared, about how loss teaches you new languages of love. Missing him still came like a familiar tide, but it no longer had the power to drag me under. Instead, missing him was a quiet presence that sat beside me as I stitched together this new life. They told me I was too old to start again, I whispered to the gathering dusk, more to myself than to anyone else. The words tasted of the rebellion that begins as something small and honest. So I started anyway. There was no trumpet, no grand reveal, only the slow, steady proof that living can be enough. The house behind me glowed in its windows like a small, faithful heart, lamps on, curtains drawn just so, the scent of tea and apples lingering at the edges. I rocked a little, feeling the rhythm move through my body, and understood clearly that the most convincing way to answer the doubts of others is simply to live out your answer every day. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.